I showed up at graduate school all psyched about Frederick Jackson Turner and westward expansion, and I find out that my people, the Western historians, are at war with themselves over this interpretation. And social history had come into Western history more and more, and people were saying, you've left out women, you've left out people of color, that story doesn't do justice to the interactions with American Indians in the West. And once I was a little bit crestfallen that my hero had been knocked off his pedestal, and also fascinated at, wow, there are a bunch of stories here that I kind of was aware of but hadn't paid attention to. And it was sort of an opening of my eyes to blind spots that I'd had, which continues to this day. I'm still working on those things. But the more I dug into it, and even though it complicated the story, and I guess in some ways of looking at it, maybe took some of the luster off it, it's made it all the more interesting to me that there were these things you can just keep digging, peeling away layers of onion, and there's more and more and more and more. So I've just been taken with it from reading about it, encountering it in person, and then the more I dig into the history of it, the more fascinating it is.
Welcome to Winning Strategies Playbook, the podcast where we welcome business leaders, CEOs, and industry experts to discuss the rise to the top, building wealth, and real estate insights. Here's your host, Jeremy Spann.
Welcome to Winning Strategies Playbook. For more information on this show, you can go to myexperiencedrealtor.com. That's experience with an ED. myexperiencedrealtor.com. Click on the podcast button. You can go through and download this episode and other episodes through all the different platforms, even listen to it on the actual website. And of course, if you're looking to buy and sell real estate anywhere on the planet and need to be connected with a trusted professional, go to the homepage, click Find a Trusted Professional. And even if it's not in Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, we will make sure you get connected with somebody that can help you with your financial interests. But today, we're more interested in the podcast with esteemed guests like Dr. Todd Kerstetter. How you doing, sir?
Very well. Glad to be here finally. We've tried, I don't know how many times to arrange this. And
since I started it.
COVID kept getting in the way, and now it's out of the way. So I'm glad to be here. And thank you for sticking with it.
Oh, yeah. No. You know me. I'm like bubble gum on your shoe. You're not going to get rid of me, right? So I've been after it, and we'll dive into who Todd is and the value he's going to bring on the show. But as always, I've got to do my joke that now inherently annoys my father-in-law and wishes that I would stop. And I thought this one was pretty fitting for the conversation we were just having about colleges. How do you know that you have been in college way too long?
I don't know.
Your parents are running out of money.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, and that just, for the purpose of the conversation with talking about with my daughter having a very good time in college right now. So for the audience, Todd and I know each other because I was his student as an undergrad at TCU. Now, you might be looking at me as saying, well, Spann, if you're almost half a century old, how old does that make Todd? Well, it actually makes Todd about the same age as me because I was older when I went to TCU to get my formal education, which was a quite different experience, I think, not only for me, but maybe even for the professors, because most students are traditional students of 18 to 22 years old. And then here's this old guy in his 30s that had been in the Marine Corps, was a police officer and working midnights and doing all this. So we'll jump into all that. But Todd, your class made a impact on me that you and I have kept in touch for even after graduation. Now would be 15 years.
Something like that.
Yeah, 15 years. And you're still at TCU.
Right.
Still a professor in the history department.
Right.
Are you still torturing people with stacks beyond stacks of not small books, but very large books that didn't even have big letters? They had little letters with big books.
And not many pictures.
Not many pictures. Like literally on the cover, that's it.
Yeah, still the books are a little bit smaller and the stack's a little bit smaller. I think I've adjusted to some of the feedback you've given me. But yeah, I'm still harassing students, and every semester on my evaluations, the one thing I can count on from multiple students is less reading, too much reading.
So for the audience I was a transfer student into TCU from the junior college, and they had based my academic curriculum off of being a traditional student, and some things had changed in my degree plan that apparently, as it turns out, when I went to do my intent to graduate at the end of year 4, that I was short 18 hours that my advisors were not aware of. And I was at TCU on a full academic scholarship. So I was like, oh man, now I got to come up with money. And I got I was literally working from 8 at night to 6 in the morning as a patrol officer, going home, showering, and then going to class and being at school all day long, because as we know in college, all the classes line up and be on the same day, back to back, right? And so I was in class till between 1 and 3 each day to go home, sleep 3-4 hours, get up and wash, rinse, repeat. That I was like, oh man, like what 18 hours am I missing? And they were 18 hours of high level classes, not like, hey, let's go learn about this basic course on math or whatever else. And so they extended my scholarship, paid for my summer class. I did a summer class, and I had 5 high level classes for that final semester, which was, I think I'd rather been waterboarded in Guantanamo Bay than to enter into that. But I wasn't going to give up. I wanted to get the full effects out of everything. And then of course I get to Todd's class, who not just has a stack of books, but one of them was the width of a tire on a vehicle, Titan, and which still sits on my shelf to this day. And but I got a great experience learning from you, learning how to learn and how to look at things in different perspectives. And so that had an impact on who I would become, and actually I attribute having great professors like you is the reason I am successful today, because it allowed me to step out of my own way and look at things from different perspectives.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you. And I want to say part of what I have appreciated about you, and one, that you stayed awake despite that schedule. I don't remember you ever falling asleep in class. And I know that's not because I was particularly exciting, but you hung in there. And I also appreciated how you, even at that time, embraced learning. You were hungry for it and took it on and tried stuff that was maybe uncomfortable or unpleasant, and like, you know, that book. And really embraced the spirit of trying stuff out and keeping an open mind. And I know darn well some of that stuff you didn't agree with, but you'd wrestle with it and talk about it and appreciated it. And a lot of the students don't get much farther than, golly, too much reading. It's like, I got tired of this. But occasionally, some will sink their teeth into it and wrestle with it and appreciate it and acknowledge that. So I've been grateful the whole time I've known you that you did that and would express that. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And you said something that was really important is, you know, we are very fortunate to live in a country where it's okay not to agree, right?
At least it used to be.
Well, it used to be. It seems a little more extreme in current climates, but it was, and that's what I didn't know then was I was actually developing a level of business acumen that would help me become more successful, because it was like, hey, are you going to pigeonhole yourself into something just because it's uncomfortable and you don't agree with it? Or are you just going to lean into it and try to learn and try to understand the other side of it, which I would later learn would help me open up lines of communication, especially when things are getting difficult, especially like you and I were talking about this significantly large deal that I'm working on right now. And I mean, it's, you're having to see the perspectives of both sides. And it does get very, matter of fact, I haven't slept in 6 weeks. I mean, in fact, if I have any hair left, and it's going to be amazing by the end of this week, but it was, but being able to learn how to do that, but also be able to go, okay, this is what the other side's perspective is. Let me just not read it and ask some questions. Let me go take that further and go research and try to understand the why behind the perspective. And an example I would give that as present day is if you were going to build a 200 square foot deck on your house a year ago, you would have spent $900 on lumber. And if you were to build that same deck today, you're going to spend $4,000 on that same amount of lumber. And people can go, okay, yes, it costs 3 times more, but can anybody tell you why? And everybody wants to blame the mills and they want to blame everybody else, but have they dove in to really truly understand why did lumber become more expensive, and will it eventually become down, and what things need to take place to be able to have that median where the lumber mills can make money at the same time the builders can also make money, where they're both making money together, where one's not losing over the other because we can't find a way to come together and do that. So when someone says, what am I going to get out of a history class at TCU? Well, let me just tell you, I just gave you a great example of what and where I learned how to be able to do that.
Right. And another thing I appreciated about having you in class was that you were non-traditional. And TCU students are great. I mean, the bulk of them, but most of them are 18 to 22-ish. And that comes with upside and downside. And I had cut my teeth teaching at a big university at Nebraska. And the classes there were a lot more diverse demographically and otherwise. And it really helps to have somebody with some mileage in class, somebody who's been around, had to work, been in the Marines, been a cop. So I think bringing that perspective is really helpful. I think it helped you deal with the material the way you did. And the other thing I love about having vets and other non-traditional students in class is they rub off on the other students frequently, and can show an appreciation of how things are going and how things fit together. And I think that mileage helps them make those kind of connections that you just talked about in that different example.
So let's go back in time of, where you come from and how you got to where you're at, and at what point did you go, I know that I want to be in education and I want to be able to, or even was it, some people, sometimes things happen by accident. Sometimes it happens from the age of 2. They know that's what they're going to. So what about you? Where you come? Where did all this start?
Boy, this might go on. This is a long story. It did not happen from when I was 2.
You're talking about me, man. I there's no longer story than me talking.
True. It did not happen since I was 2. And in fact, my experience growing up, and I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, or the suburbs outside of Cleveland. And both my parents are teachers or were teachers. And there were some things I always liked about that career. Like mostly in the summer times, we could go do great vacations. At least we had the time to go places. Didn't have a lot of money to stay at the top-notch resorts or whatever. But we could go, and I appreciated the time that they had. And I could see that they could use that time to spend with the family and to do things. But I also remember my dad coming home. He was a high school teacher with a big stain on his shirt one day, and told the story of how he'd been on lunch duty and got hit with an orange. So I was like, no, that's not going to be it. So I went away to college and didn't have a clue what I wanted to do, and took aptitude tests and so on in high school and in college, and still didn't know, and was a political science major. I chose that because I thought, that'll be practical. That'll help me with law school because I think I want to be a lawyer. And found out towards the end of my undergraduate years that I just couldn't stand political science, at least most of it. And it was too late to do what I really wanted to do, which was be a history-English double major. And then college was over and they kicked me out, and I had just kind of figured it out. So I think it's a variation on the story you mentioned. It's like you just felt kind of clueless, or it's like, I don't have a grasp of anything. And somebody said, well, yeah, it's a sign you're done, you're ready. And then I did things like take graduate school tests almost at random with no preparation. And it wasn't random. I took all of them. I took except the MCATs. I took the GMAT, the GRE, the LSAT. And I thought, this is going to show me the way. If I don't prepare for these, I'll take these and it'll show me what graduate school to go to. And I found out it's a really bad idea to take especially the law school test without any kind of practice or preparation. And my scores reflected that. The GRE, not so much. Had blew the doors off that, which I guess in a way was sort of helpful and did help me get into graduate school, but I didn't know in what. So after they kicked me out and said, you're done with school, did a lot of different things and bumped my head in a lot of sort of failed attempts at things that I thought I was interested in. I waited tables, which I came to really dislike and gave me a great appreciation of the people who do it and try to be kind to them. I worked in a sandwich shop, which was a tremendous postgraduate education. It was a place very much like a Subway, but it's not the Subway. And what I learned in there is I didn't want to work in a restaurant, for one thing, and I got a great life education in the stuff that went on in the back of the restaurant, where bookies were coming and going and drugs were being dealt. And I found out, I won't go into too much more detail about that, but I was introduced to things I had not been introduced to in other stages of my life. But it kept me going, and it was great because I could eat at the restaurant, and that took care of part of my food budget. Did freelance writing because I thought, I'll be a journalist. And I did eventually do that a little bit. Played in a rock and roll band, thought, I'll be a rock star, and found out that's a long, tough row to hoe. And also I wasn't good enough to do that. So got in, the journalism thing looked like a legitimate, decent profession. And I was really wound up because everybody I was in college with went straight to medical school or law school or graduate school in engineering. I had a couple buddies who were ROTC, and they had careers, and I was like this misfit floating around, bumbling through life, and really liked journalism and did that for a while, worked for a couple little newspapers. But there was all through these, and it took me 4 or 5 years of this, mucking around to figure out what was going on. And it really bothered me. This is a little bit embarrassing to admit that first and second and third and fourth May and June rolled around, and I had to keep going to work and work on other people's hours. That it's like, my dad didn't do that. Mm-hmm. And the journalism thing, as interesting as it was, the hours were crummy and the pay wasn't so good. I really admire the profession. And then I got a job doing PR for a university and was able to use that writing background and got back onto a college campus, and kind of the light went off. It said, this is the life, but I don't want to do PR. So I decided at that point, use that good GRE score, and I, in my heart, had wanted to do history, and especially I was interested in cowboys and Indians, to be simplistic about it. So I said, I'm going to go take a shot at that and see if I can, one, I'm going to go study it because I want to and I have the time and I can, and see if I can put together a career at a college or university doing what I want on a schedule that I like very much. And then ended up at the University of Nebraska, which turns out is a good place to go study cowboys and Indians, and spent 7 years in graduate school. And then there are some components of this we can talk about more later, maybe, if it's appropriate. But things lined up, and I did what I was supposed to do, and was lucky in a way also that I got an offer to come down to TCU and teach. It's like, there it goes. And it's been terrific. I've loved it.
What year was that you came to TCU?
I started in 1997.
1997. Wow. I guess I didn't realize that it had been, because that was 2006. So you'd already been there. When I got to your class, you'd already been there about 9 years.
Yeah. And I went away for 1 year because the first job I had was a temporary position. Okay. So I was there for a couple of years. I got a tenure track position at another school, left. And right when I left, the guy who taught my specialties retired. So I'm up there unpacking at this other location and settling into a school, which was great. But I was like, golly, there's a chance to go back to TCU, but I just came from there, and what's it going to be like applying for that job after I just took this one? And I'm glad I did, because fortunately I made a good impression while I was there, behaved myself and did what I was supposed to, competently, apparently. So they took me back, and so then that was fall of 2000. came back and have been there since.
So what was it about TCU that drew you to TCU?
Well, the first time around, just a job. I didn't know anything about
You're going to pay me? And it pays more than journalism?
Yeah.
I'm in.
And that was something that blew me away about graduate school, even though the pay was low and I had a teaching assistantship, which you get your tuition covered and you get a stipend on top of that. I think I started at $5,000 a year. But as I was looking at it, it's like, they're paying me to read history books. I'll do that. But coming back to TCU, the market, even then, for academics and college professors was horrific. I think TCU was maybe the 65th application I had sent out. So I was great. I got a job, and then I got there, and I couldn't believe how lucky I was because my interest is the American West. And Fort Worth is where the West begins. I found out very quickly after I subscribed to the newspaper here and read other stuff. And the Stockyards is here and the Amon Carter Museum. And it's just a godsend to be interested in the history of the American West and end up in a job in Fort Worth where there's all this wonderful stuff intimately tied to the history of the West. And then to take that a step further, the only reason I left was because I had essentially a temporary job and the offer of a permanent tenure track job, which is what you want as an academic because it's...
Explain what that means to the audience as tenure track.
Yeah. I had what was called an instructorship, or my title was instructor at TCU. That's a year-to-year contract, like most people. And I tell my brother about this, and he just rolls his eyes because he works in the real world and can be let go at will. So there are some faculty positions that are year-to-year contracts, or adjuncts think they're hired for a semester or maybe a year, short-term employment. Tenure track jobs are long-term, and they start off with usually a 5 to 7 year probationary period. And it's like a 5-year tryout. So they evaluate your teaching, they come visit you in the classroom. You have service expectations that you need to meet. And then the big one at most schools is publications and scholarship. So in that probationary time, at least in history, the benchmark usually is you need to publish a book, a peer-reviewed monograph that shows you have made a contribution to the profession and to learning and can succeed in creating scholarship. And if that comes out and everything else lines up, you're granted tenure, and that means you're basically locked in for life. There are ways that the university or the employer can terminate those contracts, but it's difficult. And there are certain things I could do to end that, commit a crime or, other things we won't go into. But it's really hard to get rid of somebody who's tenured. And the idea behind that is it's supposed to free up the faculty to be willing to pursue the truth and express unpopular opinions that might get them into trouble or an employer might fire them for. And I think maybe it's getting a little bit more relevant in the climate we're in now, where it's like, wow, gosh, if I do this research and it shows, trying to think of an example, shows something about, I don't know, COVID's a hoax. That's probably a bad example. But if you've got good reason and good research to take a point of view, or even just to, I guess, try to educate students, the faculty, or the university can't let you go for having an unpopular or politically volatile opinion. So it's supposed to create an atmosphere in which scholars feel free to pursue truth and knowledge as they see it.
Okay. So it's like the mafiosa.
Kind of.
Once you're in, do they do like a special ceremony where you burn a picture of a saint, rub your hands, do the little pin prick on the finger with the blood, and make an oath that you're there till you die?
It was sadly anticlimactic.
They're like, welcome, here's your packet.
Because by the time you go through this, and you have to submit this big portfolio of all the stuff you've done in that probationary period, and if you get to the point where you're submitting it, you basically know you've got your ducks in a row, and there typically are not any surprises at that point. And that's usually year 6, and then in year 7, the university spends time reviewing it, and they send that portfolio out to scholars at other schools for independent review, and they gather all this stuff up, and if that lines up, you make it. So I got a letter at one point from the university, but at that point I basically knew it was going to happen. And I kind of wish there was a little sacrifice or burning. I guess the sacrifice is by that time you've been so beaten into doing what you're supposed to do. It's like you're on the conveyor belt and conforming to professional standards.
So what percentage of professors at TCU would you speculate are tenured or on the tenure track? Is it
most
50?
Of them.
Is it most? Yeah.
And better than half, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And there's a debate about that. A lot of administrators would like to get rid of it because, we go through something like we just did this past year with COVID, and they've got all these people they're locked into hiring, and it's really hard to get rid of them. It's difficult.
So it's a line item budget deal for the administrators.
Budgetarily.
Yeah.
And there's a conception sometimes that people will get tenure and they don't do anything after that because you can't get rid of me. That's pretty rare, though. Or somebody screws up or is a pain in the neck and you can't get rid of them. But usually by the time people have jumped through that hoop, that's part of why the hoop is so difficult and why it lasts for 5 to 7 years. Is like you really size up these people that you're going to make this commitment to. And going back to your question, what's the percentage at TCU? I'm well over half. I'm a little bit embarrassed I don't know that number. But I think there's a benefit to that, to the students and to the education, because you've got these people who are long-term committed to the university. The university's got a long-term commitment to them. They, at this point in their careers, and I think at this point I'm spending as much time working on my teaching as I am on my scholarship, trying to give a better and better product to the students in my classes. And I'd like to think with the benefit of I started teaching at college level 1993, so I'm coming up on almost 30 years of that. And you get better and better with practice, and you get better and better, I think, the more you learn and research and do things. So if you've got this long-term commitment to the faculty, I think it brings benefits to the students and the quality of the education.
So when you were at the other universities, what were the sizes of the classrooms? Were they similar to TCU or were they larger?
Much bigger.
Yeah.
The very first class I taught as a graduate teaching assistant had 90 in it. I've never had a class at TCU close to that. And I also had classes of 125. So at state schools especially, they can be pretty big. At TCU, I don't think I've had a class bigger than 40, and that's an intro-level class. And at some big schools, you might have 300 or 400 students in a big auditorium in a comparable class. And some people that's fine for, but I think one of the benefits of TCU is I can do a better job with 40. This past semester, I had 2 classes that had 13, and that was mostly because of COVID. We could only have so many people in the classroom. But man, those 13-person classes were like graduate seminars. I really got to know each of those students. I could work with them. I spent a lot of time on the work that they did. And they, as far as I can tell, really appreciated that. The circumstance was they appreciated it being in person when a lot of their other classes weren't. But I think they really got something out of being in those much smaller classes. And that's, I think, one of the benefits of TCU. It's one of the benefits of paying that tuition there is if that's the kind of learning style that suits you, you get a lot of personal attention that you wouldn't necessarily get at some other places.
Yeah, I know that was very good for me because I'm ADD like a squirrel on methamphetamines anyways, where I didn't want to be in something where I was just a number. I mean, I actually wanted to learn. And one of the things I picked up on quickly at TCU is when the relationships you can develop with your professors by taking advantage of office hours, right? Where, as I'm sure you've seen, is you have some students that never even checked the syllabus to see that there were office hours, and then some that were like me. That, again, is like bubblegum on your shoe. You can't get rid of me, man. I was in there like, hey, why is this? Like, okay, I get it. You know, I got the grade that I got, but these are the comments you put in there. But why? Help me understand. I wasn't doing it to be argumentative. I was doing it because I was like, help me understand why. Why is this way? You know, even if it was something grammar wise, like, no, you can't write a paragraph like that, or whatever it was. And that's what I really enjoyed, was being able to go and understand more behind it, right? Because it was always that push to get better, or
right.
push to learn more. And I did enjoy it. And I actually enjoyed knowing the names of the people that were, you know, in the audience with me, right? That were learning. And not just that, but, you know, as far as study groups or something, that if I disagreed with another student, where it was like, you know, I could have taken the perspective of like, look, man, I got a decade on you. You don't know what you're talking about. And they could just look at me and be like, you're old. You don't know what you're talking about. But I enjoy being able to get together and go, help me understand why you see it this way. And I'm going to be willing to understand your perspective as long as you respect some time to try to understand my perspective as well. And sometimes my perspective didn't change. Sometimes my perspective didn't change, but I understood the other perspective. Sometimes it was a hybrid of in the middle. And then sometimes my perspective actually took a different turn of like, wow, I never really thought of it that way. Because, you know, someone that has, you know, 10 years of difference in the environments that we grow up in, grow up under a different set of tools, right? You know, from when guys like you and I grew up where access was the Encyclopedia Britannica, but now someone can Google on their phone whatever they're trying to get access to, just as long as they can verify the source of it, and you know, or you know, like now, you know, you're growing up with a smartphone in your hand when, you know, we were like, oh wow, what's this pager thing? Yeah. So it was just that different perspective that helped you understand, and I think that comes back to what you and I have alluded to as well, as, you know, there's a lot of turmoil, not just in the world, but in this country right now. And I think one of the things that leads to that turmoil is that people stop trying to understand each other's perspectives. And in that, which means if they're not trying to understand each other's perspectives, it means they're not communicating. And if you're not communicating, it means they're digging their heels in the sand of, I'm right, you're wrong, instead of, hey, it's okay to disagree. I mean, what are your thoughts on that comment?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack in there. And one thing that was stuck in my mind as you were talking about office hours, and I know that's not what you asked about there, but one thing I would say, if you're a college student or you have a college student in your life, go to office hours. Because even at a place like TCU, where I can spend a lot of time putting comments on a paper, I can't elaborate on those to the extent that I could in a conversation. And I know darn well, despite the fact that I try to be super clear in what I'm putting in there in terms of feedback and coaching, sometimes it doesn't come through, or the student sees, what, a C? And they don't pay any attention to it. But if you can come in and talk to the professor, they can explain that better and put them to work. They're there. Enough of that. And the other thing, still working my way to that question, was you mentioned how much technology has changed. And from when I started, even in graduate school, I think that was the first time I had an email address, was sometime in graduate school, and sometime when I learned about what the internet was and a website, to now where everybody's got a supercomputer in their pocket that's got more computing power than some of the early space capsules did. That's really changed the way I go about teaching, because it's not, I mean, you need to know how to find stuff. It's easy to find stuff, easier to find stuff, but how do you deal with it? Is that good information? Is it reliable? How are you going to triangulate that or test it? And what do you do with all the information that vomits out of that phone and then turn it into something? So it's changed how I've done that part of teaching, and it's a lot more hands-on and active, taking that information and trying to work with it and get some interpretive and analytical skills, as well as memorizing when the revolution was or the Constitution was signed. So finally, going back to, what was it you asked about?
Yeah, just how we're
not talking to each other.
Yeah, it just seems like the world's not talking with each other. They're talking to each other, not with each other. And And it just feels like people aren't trying to understand other perspectives as much.
Yeah,
And if you disagree with that, that's okay, because I disagree with a lot of things with you in class anyway. So, I mean, this is your chance to return the favor.
Yeah. No, I think you're onto something. I haven't seen it play out so much in classes so far, but I also don't know how much students are, holding back and not speaking their minds because they don't want to get into an argument with people. One of the things that is a little bit concerning to me is the atmosphere of, I guess, suspicion of elites, which would be me and you, for that matter, but in a different way, I suppose. And we had an episode recently where a member of the board of trustees at my institution made some comments in the media about the faculty being liberal, and if you don't toe the line on the socialist indoctrination that you're getting, you don't get the grade that you want, which just blew my mind. And I know that's out there. I've heard stories from some colleagues about some students kind of getting up in arms about that. But there's, I think, in certain circles, a lack of willingness to even look at those other perspectives. And as soon as they see something that's different or a threat to their perspective, walls go up, and maybe there's even attacks about that. There's a website that will list dangerous professors that you need to watch out for and need to be, blackballed or harassed. That seems to have died down a little bit. But it's made me think sometimes about what I'm going to assign in class. It's like, gosh, do I want to tackle that issue? Do I want to assign that book? And so far I haven't caved into that, but I, with some trepidation, am doing some assignments. Like, okay, is this going to get me in trouble? What kind of blowback am I going to get from this where they're going to attack or not accept the source or the perspective, even though I'm not, you don't have to agree with it. I just want you to look at it and see how it compares to this one, and let's work with it. So it hasn't changed my attitude or approach, but I can sort of feel the chill coming into the room. And for somebody who, if I didn't have tenure, I would definitely change the way I do some things in class.
Wow. For
fear of not stirring things up.
And that's really interesting too, because talking about the perspectives is, again, yet another thing when, I always get really annoyed, and I've got some of my closest friends that were like, you don't need an education, and college degree is not going to do anything for you, blah, blah, blah. I look at him and I said, man, you get out of what you put into something. And if you went to college and you didn't put anything into it to get anything out of it, then yeah, I see why you have that perspective, but that really falls on you. Because yet another thing I learned from great professors like yourself was how to verify your data, right? And that matter of fact, I was thinking about this the other day when I knew you were coming on the show, is I really expected to get a higher grade on something, right? And actually there was nothing wrong with the content that I had. It was, yeah, but where's your source to support this, right? And you'd even laid out in the project syllabus or whichever you're giving us, like, you need to make sure you have at least X, Y, Z here. And I hadn't followed. I'd followed some of the instructions, but not all of them. And I was a bit wound up, right? Like, wait, no. And here's why. And you're like, okay, well, you just articulated that really well. Why couldn't you put that in some footnotes with the verification statement? And now, what did that mean then to what does that mean now 15 years later in present day? Is I have this incredibly large deal I'm working on. This has been 3 years in the works. This portion of it is only even though this portion is very large, it's a small portion of a larger picture of what's going on. And there's a lot of people there's some people that are going to be writing some very large checks with a whole lot of zeros. And they don't just write those checks to be like, hey, let me know how it goes, right? So you better have verification of the supporting data of why this is a good financial move. And so I go in and I dive into the resources, whether it's looking at contracts, data, trailing years of data, and all those things. Is certainly the people that we're dealing with now understand and appreciate, the need and ability to go verify that. But I really learned that from it made sense then, but wouldn't really make impactful sense till present day, where I'm like, man, I'm glad I learned how to do that. I'm glad I learned how to ask questions to go, wait a minute, where do I need to dive? Because some rabbit holes, that's all they are, is rabbit holes. Mm-hmm. But there are some that lead you to something to go, whoa, wait a minute.
Right.
So, for example, on this significantly large deal, is I sent an email yesterday morning with well over 20 bullet points of everything that could go wrong after we take possession. Right? This is everything that I'm up on my dry erase board going, what could go wrong? What could go wrong? What are blind spots? What are pitfalls? And doing all that because do you, kind of like an American Express card, right? Better to have it, not need it, than need it, not have it, or not know after the transaction is done, right? So I attribute to my ability to research and dive in going back to my days of undergrad and that. And so I really do, for those younger or even older college students that are there now, if there's anything I can tell you is it might not make sense to you now, but at some point that's going to play a major role, and you're going to be glad that you learned that skill set to be able to do that, because especially in today's day and age where credibility is being attacked all the time, pretty hard to attack credibility when you got proof. Right. That even played a part into my time as a detective, because I promoted to become a detective after I graduated TCU. And trust me, you better be able to verify and prove things, or else you just put a case together where the criminal is going to go, get away, in a courtroom. So those are definitely some of the valuable skill sets that you didn't know then just how valuable those skill sets would become.
Sure.
And so I did have a great appreciation for you going, look, your content's good. Your opinion, even though may agree or not agree with it, is sound, but prove it. Right.
There you go.
Prove it.
There's an ad for a liberal arts education. And even something just as mundane as, reading for detail and read the instructions carefully.
Yes.
Putting this deal together, You better have your T's crossed and your I's dotted.
Oh, yeah. No, and it's a check that big. Trust me, I'm being asked questions and I'm like, I don't even, I understand most questions, but what? Why? But hey, listen, if it's going to help someone become more comfortable because they have the verification and proof and answers to the questions that they have in order to be comfortable with something this large, then I understand that. I understand that perspective. And so let's tackle back a little bit to the American West. So what is it about the American West that just, because I know that's your passion, right? Only because I've known you for a long time. It is, what was it about that just drew you to it? Like, what made you so passionate about this portion of history?
Thank you for asking. And you didn't take that class. That's the best class I teach. You got one of the B team classes.
I got the Industrial Revolution class, which was, by the way, awesome.
Progressive Era, which has since been rebranded as Hellraisers and Robber Barons. A lot more students take it now.
Oh, because it's got a really cool name.
Yeah.
Did they get there until you see the stack of books?
So the West is something I'll blame my parents for again, and for reading to me when I was a kid. And I can't exactly understand why, but they, for one thing, read to me out of, or got me reading both, Little House on the Prairie books, which just fascinated me. The Laura Ingalls Wilder story. And beyond that, and I think because I showed interest in that, they hooked me up with a novel about a kid who was about my age going west on the Oregon Trail, and what it was like being on a wagon train and running into Indians, and how weird the Great Plains were, and trying to travel across this desert, or so it seemed, grassland, huge grassland in a wagon train. So that stuff caught my imagination when I was little. And one of the blessings of having educator parents was probably I was 12 or 13. We packed up the car and went on about a month car vacation where we drove from Cleveland across Nebraska to Denver through the mountains. I went to Yellowstone, made it over to San Francisco, down the coast of California, to San Diego, and then kind of up diagonally from there back to Cleveland. And I still remembered that trip in particular. It's just being stunned by the landscape. Growing up in Ohio, which is kind of a forested place, it looks basically like New England. It's green and trees, and there's a lake right there by where I grew up. To go out and spend like 2 days driving at the speed limit across this grassland that was the plains and feeling exposed and tiny and amazed at what this landscape was. And then having a similar experience getting into the Rocky Mountains, like, holy cow, I think those were the first mountains. Well, I'd been to Appalachia before that, but the scenery in Yellowstone, and thinking about what it took for the United States to expand and for the settlers to go out there and start these cities and farmsteads in the middle of nowhere to me. And it was just awe-inspiring. A lot of it had to do with the landscape, and that's part of how I write about water as well, but I'm really into environmental history and how does landscape and geography influence people and history. But I think it's having seen that stuff up close and being so impressed by it and being impressed by the stories. And of course, on the trip, every place we'd stop, my parents being teachers, we'd go to museums, I'd pick up books. One was Log of a Cowboy by Andy Adams, which is a story about this guy on a cattle drive from Texas up to Nebraska and beyond. So that got me started on it. And then when I realized later that there was this whole, you could like create an academic program around that, and there were people who had written books on it and theorized about the West. One in particular, a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, who's really outdated. He wrote about this in 1893 at the time, or shortly after the frontier had supposedly closed and there was no more wild area to be settled. And his idea was that process of the United States expanding westward and people coming into the contact repeatedly with wilderness and, as he called it, savagery, changed them and made a unique people that could be Americans and declare independence from the British and set up a democratic republic. So I was just taken with that. And now I got to backtrack because I've been using a lot of almost politically incorrect language and talking about this in a way that doesn't get at the fullness of the story. I showed up at graduate school all psyched about Frederick Jackson Turner and westward expansion, and I find out that my people, the Western historians, are at war with themselves over this interpretation. And social history had come into Western history more and more, and people were saying, you've left out women, you've left out people of color, that story doesn't do justice to the interactions with American Indians in the West. And then once I was a little bit crestfallen that my hero had been knocked off his pedestal, and also fascinated at, wow, there are a bunch of stories here that I kind of was aware of but hadn't paid attention to. And it was sort of an opening of my eyes to blind spots that I'd had, which continues to this day. I'm still working on those things. But the more I dug into it, and even though it complicated the story, and I guess in some ways of looking at it, maybe took some of the luster off it, it's made it all the more interesting to me that there were these things you can just keep digging, peeling away layers of onion, and there's more and more and more and more. So I've just been taken with it from reading about it, encountering it in person, and then the more I dig into the history of it, the more fascinating it is. So, and one last thing, I got to throw this in, because this was part of my kind of awakening, such as it is. My PhD program required that I demonstrate reading proficiency in 2 languages other than English. And I had some background in German, so I was able to tick that box, but I needed another one. And one of the dumb luck things about going to graduate school at Nebraska was they were offering instruction in Lakota, which is a Sioux Indian language. And I kind of had to ask around about this. I was like, well, will you take that? Does it have to be French or Italian? Or it's like, no, especially if you're studying the West, this makes perfect sense. And that was one of the best experiences of my life, taking that language that opened my eyes in a lot of ways to how language can reflect really different cultural values. And one of the people who taught it was team taught by an anthropology professor and a woman who'd grown up as a fluent native speaker on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. I got to know her, got to know a different perspective on that. And that was one of those things I came across. And it's like, wow, this is going to be hard and it's going to slow me down because I'm going to need to take 4 semesters of this language. But it was one of the best decisions I ever made for the reasons I said. And it also, and a lot of that was just, I'm only going to be here once in my life. There's this opportunity. I better grab it. But then, and it was interesting just on that level, but it also opened up the possibility of doing some research. And I found in the State Historical Society in Lincoln a run of newspapers that were printed in a dialect of Lakota that nobody had ever looked at because nobody speaks it anymore. So there's this treasure trove of documents that I could get into, and it gave me better marketability as a Western historian, that I could bring this rare skill set to the table. And it wasn't just theoretical. I was able to get one of my first big publications was because I had access and could use those sources. And I wrote an article about the Wounded Knee Massacre using those sources that nobody had ever been able to do because historians couldn't access the Dakota language sources. So it had some practical applications, but I really just did it because it was interesting. And it was, gosh, when am I going to have a chance to do this again? And ends up being a really important part of my education and part of my life. But that was something too that's like, there's this exotic stuff in the West to me that just has always fascinated me.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is even when I think I know someone really well, when I do this show, it unlocks things that I realize we have in common even more than what we had in common. And a couple of key points was, when you were talking about, how language reflects, culture, right? And I've always been a big proponent of learning other languages. I've learned 3 foreign languages myself, Romanian, Mandarin, and Spanish.
Wow.
And
easy ones.
Oh, yeah. No, I picked the easiest ones right off the bat, right? Because I like to get off the beaten path. Because, I think if you know how to communicate with people, it's really important, right? And then you can get off the beaten path because as you're able to communicate with people, then you can go try different cuisines. Because I think food tells a lot of history on that culture. So, especially since Laura and I are avid travelers, and, when Maggie, before she went to college, we would take her all over the world and just go get off that beaten path to see things and taste things. And like, hey, why this particular dish? What meaning does this have? Like, we go do culinary tours, right? Like, my daughter really got excited when we were in Budapest, and we were on this all-day tour, right, talking about this is what this particular food meant to the Hungarian people and why it is still here, so much further out from time. And then hearing you talk about, the landscape and geography and how that affects migration. Mm-hmm. That is one of the major data points that I use in understanding trends in real estate is, kind of going back to the lumber example is like, okay, people are moving here to Texas. They're moving to Florida. They're moving to Tennessee. But why? Right? And because it's one thing when a group of folks move or migrate because they want to be with people that are like-minded. But when you start seeing all kinds of different perspectives and attitudes and everything moving to, the 3 most migratory states, you have to go, why is this occurring? Is it because of natural resources? Is it because of jobs? Is it because of taxes? Is it because of any number of 50 different, items to understand that? Because then if you can understand the migration flow with the supply and demand, of what there is in real estate, then you can try to understand why prices are going up, and you can also understand what availability of houses there are for people to go purchase. And so that's a interesting another interesting thing just hearing you talk about this. But you're talking about doing the road trip. As I am almost done with this book called "Don't Make Me Pull Over." Do you know what book I'm talking about? It's called "Don't Make Me Pull Over: The Informal Story of the Family Road Trip" by Richard. It's Ratay. And so, what year was it that you did that month-long road trip?
Oh, gosh. It must have been, it was 1976 because it was the bicentennial year.
Okay. So this is the peak in the book. And I know this because I was just listening to part of it when I was driving back to Colorado on Sunday is right there in the mid 70s was the peak of this. So, in the book, it talks about how, going into the history of the highway systems was actually not meant for cars. It was actually meant for bicycles. Well, according to this book.
Well, some of them.
Yeah.
The early paved roads movement there was a big bicycle fad in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Yes.
But then the interstate system, which is where I was most of the time, was part of the defense in the Cold War.
Yes. The book talks about that, and Eisenhower going, hey, we're going to complete this. And then even the, federal government state relationship of interstate highways and money that's involved in there for road improvements and so forth. And even it talks about the, how this guy would literally get in his car, like talking about the Stuckies.
Oh yeah, I remember Stuckies.
He would get in a vehicle and drive till he had to use the bathroom. And then that's where X marks the spot, and then go again until to kind of estimate where these stops would be, that evolved into giant fiberglass hot dog statues and all this other stuff to make it the attraction of the reason he came up with parks was because, landowners were tired of people just driving and camping out on their property because they were on a road trip. And then how that added to the Department of Interior for infrastructure for these parks and it just all these number of different things. Really a fascinating book to go, hey, we learn more about this and how a lot of the 70s, what took place in the 70s was when a lot of these things were happening, because it was also when we were experiencing stagflation, right? Mm-hmm. And all these different things that were going on, where the things that contribute to this aren't just, hey, we want to get in the car and go, but there was economics involved, through this, business involved through this, the satisfying the interest and hunger to learn about, like you said, Yellowstone, and being able to go to all these different places, where I think that now, even after getting through this book, has given me that perspective to go, wow, but that's really fascinating, because where else can you be that you're not crossing, port of entry checks to drive as many miles as you can in this great nation to go see so many different beautiful things.
Right.
I mean, if you haven't been to Yellowstone or the Grand Tetons, or you haven't, been in rugged Montana during the middle of winter, where you're looking at raw, untouched land that is covered in snow, that some people have never even left the state, let alone the county or city they live in, to go to the northwest part of the U.S. to see something that is just absolutely magical, and it just touches your soul, right?
It sure got mine.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, you kind of made a profession of talking about it.
That's right. And speaking of bicycles, as dramatic as those car trips were, and I think there were 3 or 4 of them, the one that I mentioned was the most made the greatest impression. But going back to bicycles, as I was trying to figure out, bumming through those awful different jobs that I had, I ran into a guy who convinced me that we should quit our newspaper jobs and ride our bicycles from Myrtle Beach to Vancouver. And so all right, let's do that. And not only do you get the sense of the travel and the awe, but traveling by bicycle or walking, and I know you're a hiker, gives you a whole different connection with that landscape and what it's like riding into the wind or with a tailwind or whatever. So,
And especially being in Texas where there's not a lot of elevation change, right? When you're up there in Colorado and you're going from 6,000 elevation up 12,000 elevation, carrying a pack and just understanding even how the human body responds to something like that, but getting true fresh air, or like what I've experienced this last week is being up in Colorado with very good, cool weather that is dry, and then you get back here and it is hot and swampy and humid. The other day, I was, maybe this was yesterday or the day before, I was like, does it seem like hot in the house? Because the AC says 73. And she was like, yeah, you're from here. If you forgot, this is called Texas, right? It's like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. I want to ask a question, and I realize that this question is a landmine. And I always just tell folks, look, if it's a landmine you don't want to step on, I am totally okay with it. But you know me, the answer is always no unless I ask, right? So with a lot of turmoil going on in this country right now, and you being an advocate of history, we're seeing some things now that I'm very conflicted on. Meaning, I have opposing opinions, not to the subject I'm going to ask about, but I can see both perspectives. But I'm torn of where I feel I should be on this. History is history, right? Good, bad, or indifferent, good or ugly. And we're seeing situations where a lot of statues are being taken down. Being a lifetime in history, from someone in your perspective, how do you feel when you see something like that? Or what is your take on it, or professional take on that?
Personal and professional. And I'm glad you asked. And I've had this conversation with a number of people, including my parents. And one of the things that I think has helped me as a historian and teacher is my parents are diametrically opposed on things. Got one's in one room watching MSNBC and Rachel Maddow, and the other's in the other room watching Fox. And my mom in particular, it was really upset about the statue stuff. And I did an assignment at the very beginning of class. I think it was two years ago. It was the summer when the Charlottesville thing had been going on and when statues had been being removed. And I threw some of the news stories at the students and asked them to think about this and put together the arguments for each case. And I can't remember if I asked them to take a stand on which one they preferred, but I wanted to bring that up because it's important and it's related to what I do in terms of what gets remembered about history. What history do we tell? How do we tell it? Should we tell it certain ways? Have I gotten you to forget the question yet? So it depends. It depends on the statue and the process. And I'll back into this, I guess, with we're dealing with this at the TCU campus. I don't know if you're aware of that. There's a statue of the founders, Addison and Randolph Clark, who were Confederate soldiers. And it has come up. There are some students who are upset by that. And TCU is going through something called the Race and Reconciliation Initiative, where they're addressing their past as an institution that was founded by Confederate veterans, as an institution that was segregated until, I think, the 60s. So African Americans couldn't attend in the Jim Crow South. And what do we do with that? And I think they have taken I like the approach they've taken. They didn't tear down the statue. They left it up there. But they're using it as a teaching moment. They're going to put a display up. There's already a text up there about who these guys were and what's going on. And I think in a case like that, you can appreciate what these guys did beyond their days as Confederates and how they made a contribution to education and were in some ways really progressive. It was one of the first places that women could get an education. So as I see it, you got to in some ways go back into time when these things happened and deal with these people under the terms in which they lived and the times in which they lived. So I'm only at the edge of the landmine. there are other statues I don't mind seeing come down. And some of this, I think, I realize has come from who I am and where I came from. I grew up in Ohio. I grew up in a town that has a Civil War monument in its town square and its town park. And it's a Union soldier who commemorate I think it was Perryville, Chickamauga, and I forget what the other battles are, where people from my hometown in the 1850s went out and fought. So the Confederate ones, I typically don't have too much trouble taking those down. Here's why. And some of this is personal, I guess, but historically speaking, some of those guys were traitors, as I see it. They were fighting against the United States. They seceded. They were fighting against the Union. They were fighting against the Army of the United States. I understand that they founded their own country and that there's a certain kind of patriotism that goes with that country. But I kind of have a problem with memorials to traitors, as I see it. Then you get, that's at the most, at one level, then you get into how does it tie into slavery and what's it mean to have Confederate monuments up? And that's problematic in other ways, as I see it. And I wish I had known this question was coming. One of the best
I did not plan it.
Yeah.
You know me, it just things pop in my head.
And the reason I say that is one of the speeches I saw that really affected me, and I thought the guy who gave the speech did a great job at laying out why he and his city was approaching these monuments the way he did, was the ex-mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu. I thought he did a beautiful job explaining the situation as he saw it, why he was in favor of taking some of these things down. And to keep talking about this, when I had the conversation with my mom, her point was, or what she was upset about was, they're erasing history. And I don't think that's the case. And I think there's something else you can do with that. You're taking down a monument. Somebody at some point made the decision to put up a monument. And a lot of times those things were put up 40, 50 years after the fact, when Jim Crow was really hitting hard and there was a lot of controversy about this. And I'm pretty sympathetic to the interpretation that those things were being put up. Sure, partly to commemorate the service, partly to commemorate soldiers. But I think also there was a message there about who's in charge and how it's going to be and what's the social order. And I think taking those down or taking those things down isn't erasing it. It's changing what you're going to remember, how you're going to remember it, what kind of history you're going to write. I don't have any objection to, say, putting them in a museum and say, here's this thing. And we used to have this up in town square and we took it down and put it here, and here's why. And it kind of goes, I think, in some ways to the nature of history, that generations write and rewrite history. It's not history's history, I think you said. Mm-hmm. Kind of.
Right.
It gets rewritten, it gets revised. It depends on the perspective of who's writing it. And I think this generation is dealing with that stuff that's been sort of a third rail in ways. And in some ways, it hasn't been thought about. It was fascinating to me growing up in Ohio. I went to college in North Carolina. That was the first time I'd lived outside of the North. And people called me carpetbagger or Yankee. I was like, what? What's going on? Mm-hmm. And it didn't
or even, what is that?
Yeah, and I kind of had to think about it. A Yankee I got easy enough, carpetbagger. So there's a lot of stuff out there still. And now I think I've kind of wandered off point here. I should shut up because I want to hear what's going through your mind. And
no, and those are very good perspectives.
I'm awaiting a counterattack.
Right, and I realize, and I have a tendency to do that on this show. Is a question will form in my head, and I'll always preface it as, "Hey, look, this is probably a landmine," and you don't want to, because I can understand that, right? Because it is it can. Depending on who the audience is, it can be a very polarizing topic, not just from one side, but from multiple sides. Is the reason I've had a lot of conflict of wondering where I feel that I should sit on it is I go back to my own history, right? And 2 points that I'll bring up. So Kevin Davis who used to be at TCU, has since left. Very good friend of mine, just came on to record his second episode this week, is a 6'6" tall black guy. And when we did his first episode, I was very open to go, hey, listen, I grew up in an area where the first black person I ever met was in the Marine Corps, right? And so people can think whatever they want to think of me because of that, or make their assumptions or anything else. And then they go, well, you're whatever. I'm like, well, why don't you call Kevin Davis and ask him what his opinion of me? Because really, if I don't know you, I don't care about yours. I care more about him,
right?
And what he thinks of me. And so then fast forward to going into the Marine Corps, where a lot of people really want to romanticize what being in the military is, but I'm going to call it for what it is. I went in there. I was designed to be an instrument of war. I was designed to be violent. And if I wasn't violent, they were going to make me violent. And so that was a large chunk of my life, was to not only learn how to be violent, but be more violent than the opposing force so we don't lose.
Right.
Now, the interesting part is now I've been out 25 years, and my wife and my daughter sometimes forget that part of me, right? But then, they'll sit there and like an example I've used on a couple of these is because I've never really shown that side of me to, well, I mean, it maybe had a little, bullet points that came out with one boyfriend that my daughter had that I wanted him to understand who I was and where I came from. He's no longer in the picture. Yeah, he's no longer in the picture. So apparently my articulation of my past really worked. But my daughter is like, Dad's not, he's not scared of anything. And my wife will tell her, man, you'd be really surprised the funny things your dad is scared of, and like say, like your dad is terrified of heights. When we're up on the ski lift up in Colorado, and sometimes it stops and it sits there swinging, he doesn't say anything, and the average normal person wouldn't know that he's terrified, but I'm married to the man, and I know what terrified looks like in that man, and I'm looking at her, and she's making fun of me. She starts swinging the damn thing, and I'm like, you better stop right now, just because, that's Laura. But my wife knows, who I was and what I did and what I was designed to go be. So being that is a part of my history, it'll never not be a part of me, even though I don't go demonstrate that or execute that now. But absolutely, if the right environments were to present itself, country was under attack, defending my family, friends, whichever else, that animal inside of me would absolutely present itself. And it was trained to be better than the other people. And so me, maybe, I'm getting to the point of what it is, I still have, some things that represent my time in the Marine Corps, and those things aren't on display. And it's not because of any other reason. Is I didn't go do what I did in the PD and the Marine Corps because I wanted to have something on my wall that said, yay, look at me. There's nothing wrong with that. I always make that point, but that was who I was. But it's still who I was. Like that still is a part of my existence. It is still a part of me of, without going in and making sausage out of it and breaking down into details of who I can be if I need to be, because I was that person at one time. So does that make sense? Kind of, along that way is,
sure.
I don't want to erase who I am. But that was certainly a part of who I am. And actually, I'm very, not to say that, I don't want people to confuse it as I'm proud that I was a violent man. I was proud that I was willing to go do violence on behalf of people in this country to protect these people.
Sure.
And it does take a unique person to be okay with going and doing that,
And we got to have that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, but it is a part of my history. Right. And it is funny every once in a while when Laura, we're just sitting here on the couch, we're watching TV and, and just hanging out. And I don't know, whatever show comes up or a commercial on a movie, maybe it's a war movie or commercial for the Marines or whatever. And she'll just stop and she'll look at me and she goes, I sometimes forget that that's also who you are. Right. And that will never leave you. And that's what make you who you are. So that's one of the reasons why I'm conflicted over that whole topic. And I really don't, and again, I mean, I don't have an opinion that supports one side over the other. It's just, but I am in conflict over it.
Right.
Because I don't quite know how to view it or process it, because I see and understand both sides. And I don't want it to be someone going, well, you just don't want to take one side. No, actually, you need to get to know me a little bit better and understand that I am internally conflicted over,
right.
Do I stay in conflict, or do I choose a side, or, whichever. So it is a tough thing, but history is a part of who we are. And history is, tells the story, and history is not always pretty. Right?
Right.
It's like when, you have people go, hey, the Holy Bible. I'm like, hey, man, you really dive in. You're gonna read some not so pleasant things in that book. And, because things are not all rainbows and butterflies.
Right.
I mean, that's the truth of the matter. Right.
And I think part of where I struggle with it, and why I don't have an objection to taking down some of those statues, is I don't want to erase the history. I don't want to not have it there. I want the story told. But in those public spaces, that's more than telling a story to me. It's more than recording history. There are ways you can keep those things and remember that history. But in those public spaces, that's something that's literally up on a pedestal, glorified, celebrated. And I'm not convinced that's the way to handle that part of history. Don't want to erase it. Don't want to forget about it. But are we still in 2021 celebrating that and having that sends a message about who the community and who the people were there and how it works, I think.
Yeah.
And I want to commend you. I think you tap danced around that landmine way better. Way better than I did.
Well, it was an unexpected question that just, like I said, sometimes things pop up. Speaking of history, and it was really interesting because I didn't even realize how fast this time goes by. And I just want to get kind of a quick blurb of what you thought of the book that I sent you, the Storm Before the Calm by George Friedman, right? And because I found it to be interesting, and I think I sent like 20 copies to people that I thought would not just read it and be like, blah, but read it, embed themselves in it, and then have an opinion of it. What were just the highlights of what did you think of that?
Sure. And I want to say, shortly after you sent it to me, I ran across something about Alice Walton that said she's reading it. It's like, oh, okay, Jeremy's onto something here. This was an important book. I should read it. So I did, or at least most of it. And I thought it was really interesting. And in case you haven't, he talks a lot about geopolitics, and his argument in this book is that there are two different kinds of cycles that basically dictate history, and especially in the United States. I forget the title. One's socioeconomic and the other's institutional cycles. Yes. And one's got to do with government, one's got to do with culture and society and other things. And I thought it was fascinating, these cycles. And it kind of gets – part of it, though, took me back to my days in political science that I rebelled against because I was like, some of these theories I don't really follow. The first part of the book, though, and I think there are 3 sections to it. The first part is a lot of history. And parts of it I was just in love with because he's talking about, for one thing, rivers, which I'm pointing at a book here. I'm fascinated by rivers, and I'm currently working on a research project about Fort Worth and water and the Trinity and other things. So I think, you go, and we're talking about rivers and how they shaped history. And I think he was right on a lot of those things. But what drove me nuts about it, and what finally made me, I can't, is that first part. And to his credit, he is painting with a really broad brush. But he goes through this history of the United States in the first part of the book to set up his models of cycles. And there's stuff in there that just drove me nuts as a historian. Where I think part of the argument he's making is that the United States in some ways is ahistorical, that there's this thing that cropped up and it doesn't have any ties to anything before it. And oddly enough, he'll make a statement, or he makes a statement sort of like that, and then kind of goes into the history of what led up to this thing. So it bothered me that he seemed to think that the United States just came out of nowhere in some ways and created this thing, and this that's driven by these cycles, and didn't pay attention to that history and where it came from. And I was afraid you were going to ask me about this, so I tried to do some homework about this. He makes a statement about the United States government coming out of no place where there hadn't been one before. And I think I get what he's saying about that. And I think he's talking about the Constitution and the government that has gone from that point on. But that statement, whether or not he intended it that way or I misread it, really ran all over me, because I was like, there was an entity that was organizing the Continental Army, and there were governments in those colonies that existed before that. That's maybe being a little bit nitpicky, but part of the way they organized was in something called the Continental Congress that ran that war, and that was organized under the Articles of Confederation for a period before the Constitution. Now, that government under the Articles of Confederation sucked and had a lot of problems, which is why they threw it out and wrote the Constitution. But it's not like there was nothing there. There wasn't a void before that. And at another point in the book, he talks about in the Jefferson administration and Thomas Jefferson's thinking about the country and the continent and geopolitics. And he references two laws passed by the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So it's like, did you just tell me that there's no government before this one, but that government passed these laws that were critical to understanding this other stuff? So
counterintuitive.
I didn't know if it. I don't know where to go with that.
Yeah.
I respect the guy. I know he's super smart and has written lots of books, and his book is on a commercial press and sells more than I'd ever dream of selling. So I don't want to do him a disservice. But the stuff he was doing with history, to me, was kind of sloppy and contradictory. And that got in the way of me going along with the cycles model that he cooked up based on the history that he told me, which I thought was problematic. So despite what I enjoyed it. I'm glad I encountered it. And I think the section on the cycles holds up for me better than the stuff on the history in the first part of the book. And related to the cycles, one of the things, and I'm curious to hear how you thought about this. So the ahistoricalness, the ahistoricity of it bothered me. And also, one of the things that just chaps me sometimes is I'll read people talk about inevitability. And I just don't buy that as a concept, that there's like these historical inevitabilities. Like, yeah, we can look back to 1776. It's inevitable that the colonists were going to win that war. It's like, no, there were some contingencies along the way. There were things that happened. And to me, it seems to take away some element of human agency and choices that people make. So I think the cycles are interesting, and I think he's on target. And when he's talking about those cycles, I'm like, oh, okay, I get that. And I actually talk about some of that stuff in my classes, but in different ways. Like one of the cycles is founding of the country up until the Civil War. It's like, yep, that's definitely something, whether you call it a cycle or something else. There's that period where this nation was founded and it wasn't done yet. It took getting to the Civil War and fighting that war and getting past it and going through Reconstruction. I tend to think of it more as like a chapter, cycle, whatever. But as I understood the book, it took too much of humanity and agency out of it and replaced it with these cycles that seemed like work despite what people do. And I'm trying to think. There's something else related to that, but I'll hush.
So I followed George Friedman for a long time. And again, even writers that I like and I enjoy reading from doesn't mean I agree with 100% of anything that they say. And I was really interested, out of all the people I sent, and numerous people I sent this book to, and even other professors that I've known, but you're the only historian professor that I had sent it to. And I was curious on it because I was just like, Oh yeah, there's not a lot of
Footnotes?
yeah, footnotes, verifications in there, and I was like, this is just going to drive Todd batshit crazy, right?
I was going to stay away from that. Yeah, but that was one of the first things I did because I would read some of his claims. It's like, where, why,
where
how?
did you get that? Yeah,
Right.
And so I was curious, from a historical perspective, right, of what you had thought about that, and then some of the, I do think that there are trends, right, and but one thing I don't necessarily agree with is just because this might have been a trend multiple times before means that that's where the trend is going to take us next. Could or could not. Because I think if anything 2020 showed us is that there's a lot of unpredictable things that are caused by nature that no one could have forecasted. Right? Or like the running joke I make with people is, well, how are we going to respond to COVID-20? And they're like, what's COVID-20? I was like, I don't know. We had 18, 17, 16, 15, and 14 before we had 19. So who knows what 20 looks like? And when you look at 20 years ago, this September, we were attacked as a nation by terrorists. And 2 decades later, we're still taking our shoes off at the airport.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's just humans are interesting creatures in that they are responsive to things that they've seen. Right? Just like right now, what I face a lot in my industry is people going, well, the housing crisis of 2008. And I have to correct them. I'm like, no, it's a lending crisis. It was actually not a housing crisis. I was like, and it was because we stopped building houses of why we have the shortage today. And then you add on a pandemic with supply chain interruptions and everything else, which is making it even more expensive and harder to build with shortage of labor and materials only augments that even more. But people remember things that they experience more than they read it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then now we're entering we just came out of came out of an election with a lot of turmoil in it. And my expectation is the next election is going to be have just as much turmoil, if not more, right? But then people, I look at him and go, by the way, one of the things I did enjoy about the book is this is not the first time we've had a lot of turmoil in some elections, right? But what does that do for us, right? Where does that set us? Where does that take us? And what do we do as humans? Because, when we were leaving the first institutional cycle into the second, during and after the Civil War, the level of technology then was not what it is today. And even then going from there to the Great Depression and World War II for the second institutional cycle is there was a lot of technology, maybe not computers and everything else, but as I got to learn in your class, when we were, studying, of that industrial revolution era where it's not a supercomputer, but things drastically changed, right? And we've had technology at our fingertips for so long now, several decades, from the time you got your first email address to now we got supercomputers in our pants pocket but the interesting thing even about technology is Elon Musk can give NASA a shuttled ride to the International Space Station, but you and I can't talk on the cell phone without it dropping a call, right? I mean, there's something interesting about that to me. And so, which tells me is there is still a technology gap that is still yet to be fulfilled that we don't even know. Some people may call it AI or whatever number of different things, but none of us, I don't think, really know what that will look like, and how will that shape us? Right. Because, like when we were studying, in your classes, I mean, 7 12-hour days was the norm to survive. How many people working 7 12-hour days besides myself right now? Probably not a lot, right? Right. And that's just because I've got brain damage and there's something wrong with me that I just enjoy working. So the thing I did take from the book is, there is trends that are occurring And I think the responsibility of all of us is just not just Americans and citizens and humans, is that instead of letting this trends or cycles get out of control, it's really, we could prevent it from doing that, right? Now, whether we do or don't, only time is going to tell, but we do have an opportunity to correct the course that we are currently on, or else I do believe that things are going to get more violent. Look at violent crime across the country right now. It's higher than it's been since the 90s, right? And that's a reality of it. And if folks don't start learning to come together and communicate, try to see each other's perspectives, and be able to be like, hey, we need to be able to live with each other, even though we don't agree with each other, then things can potentially get incredibly violent. Now, do I think it's going to be the end of this country or anything else? I mean, people hate Trump, people hate Biden, whatever else, one's a socialist, one's a dictator, one's a whatever, I'm like, okay. But at the end of the day it starts in our communities. And in these micro communities, even within a city of Fort Worth, inside of our own little smaller communities, to be able to come together and be able to say, hey, how do we get to a point where maybe we don't agree on things, but we can agree to work together, so that way we can make it a win-win for everybody moving forward. And so when I read the book, in my mindset is I wish a lot more people would read the book, so that way maybe it would force them to come to the table to say, hey, what this book is talking about that could potentially happen, it's in all our best interests for that not to happen.
Yeah.
And that was kind of my take from it.
And I agree with all that 100%. And I'm all for the issues he brings up and getting people to think about it. And even though I kind of had a reaction against how he treated history or wrote history, one of the things I like about the book very much is it's out there, and he's making a bold case for something. And it really got me involved with reading the book, thinking about it. It's like, does that really work? And I think a good book doesn't necessarily answer a bunch of questions. It might, but it brings up questions. And if it gets people engaged, like you said, that's terrific. Yeah. So I definitely, gosh, maybe edit this out and put it back to my big response earlier. Is like I would not tell people not to read it by any means. I'm glad I did, and I would recommend it to get people thinking about that stuff.
So you've written a few books yourself. Sitting here looking at two of them. You had another one in your bag that I already have. I keep on my shelf at my house in Colorado. So how many books have you written so far?
3.
3? Okay.
4 is in the gestational period. Will be delivered sometime in the next 3 to 7 years.
So out of these 3, and I know this was like trying to figure out which one was your favorite kid, which one of these is your favorite kid out of the 3 you've written?
Gosh, well, they all did different things for me. The first one, God's Country, Uncle Sam's Land, Faith and Conflict in the American West, was my dissertation, turned into my book. That meant a lot to me. It involved some of that research I mentioned earlier, where I was using Lakota language sources. That got me tenure, and it was fascinating to me. And it was really about getting at what does the West mean through the lens of religion. And one of the things, it's a little tangent here, it bothered me when it came out and it got cataloged and put in the religious history section of the library under the BLs in the Library of Congress cataloging system. It's like, no, it belongs in the E's or the F's with the American West stuff. So it's really about trying to get at what does the West mean? What has it mean to people? What's it mean to the nation? And when you throw religion in there and look at 3 case studies, and the book's partly about Mormons in the 1850s through the 1890s. It's about the Lakota ghost dance and the Wounded Knee Massacre, and it's about the Branch Davidians and the Branch Davidian tragedy that happened in 1993, and how these 3 religious groups found a place in the West, and in their religious experiences kind of pushed American society to the edge of its tolerance for what can we handle? What are we willing to accept in American society? Plural marriage, no. Profits, no. Trouble, converting semi-automatic weapons into fully automatic, no. And So, and that all those things happened in the American West, which has this reputation for being this wide open space where people can go be who they are and enjoy maybe the greatest extent of liberty and freedom in the country. And these people got shut down largely because of their religious beliefs and the behaviors that it inspired in them. I thought was fascinating. So I had a blast doing that one, and it really helped me professionally. The second one was an outgrowth of the first, and that is Inspiration and Innovation, Religion in the American West. That is a textbook. It was awful to write because and I got invited to do that because some people who were doing this series read the introduction in the first book and thought, wow, he really can spell this stuff out. Clearly, we're going to do a religious themed book on the West. Let's ask him to do it. And I foolishly accepted. And writing a textbook is really tough because it covers the entire span of American history from pre-contact and American Indian religious beliefs up until whenever it came out. I think I take that book up to about 2010 or so. So there are a few things in there that I kind of knew about before I got into it, but I had to teach myself an awful lot to be able to fill in the gaps. So that thing took forever, and it was like a root canal that went on for 5 years. And it's a textbook, so it reads like a textbook. It's not my greatest writing. And then the last one, Flood on the Tracks, Living, Dying in the Nature of Nebraska in the Elkhorn River Basin, is kind of bizarre. It's sort of an eco-biography of a river basin in northeast Nebraska. And as I was telling you earlier, it's sort of a flyover river in a flyover part of the country, but I think there's some lessons to be learned in there about how people came to live in that river valley, what the river has meant to them, how it was life-giving to them and important to the economic foundation of the communities in the basin, and yet it takes a toll on them because, like rivers do, it floods and it has killed people. So it's kind of like the river giveth and the river taketh away. So there are those kind of stories in there, and also sort of the evolution of how people have coexisted with the river, from basically having to take it as it is to trying to channel it and control it to now the policy. And I've seen this go on in other parts of the country too. It's like, we got to get out of the floodplain. It's going to flood. We're just going to keep paying for disaster relief and having trouble if we stay in there. So let's get out. And I like that one, even though it's kind of about this remote place, because I started it when I was in graduate school, and I could see sort of prototype Todd in there, and there was some really primitive, not well done history in there. I picked it up after I had not worked on it for about 20 years, and it gave me a chance to appreciate how far I had come as a historian and a writer, and to take that story that was not very well done in the 90s and redo it and make it better. So, and that helped me get promoted. So, so it's got that going for it as well. But it turned out to be really fun to do. And I could see when I went back and researched it, it's like, wow, how did I miss this? How did I miss that? And I found these photos and maps that I hadn't seen before. And I could really use those to enrich the discussion about what did it mean to live here. And I also realized, as I found some of those sources, even if I had found them in the 1990s, I wouldn't have known what to do with them. So that was really gratifying to be able to do that. And that's the launching pad for my book, on the book project I'm doing on Fort Worth, because I'm going to do similar issues but expand that. And it's not just going to be flooding. It's going to be a microcosm of the Trinity Valley. And it's not just going to be the river. It's going to be how did water from the springs and the wells that were the early water source important to Fort Worth, to, if I get really artistic, sometimes I think about, if you were to follow a raindrop as it fell on Fort Worth in 1878, what would it tell you as it landed on a dead animal in the middle of Main Street and then ran through and drained into the Trinity? And a guy I admire a lot, William Dupuis, writes about rivers and water because water collects in low places. He says consequences collect in low places. And that's kind of the entry point, not only into that book, but also into, I think, what I'm going to do with Fort Worth. It'll be sort of an environmental history of Fort Worth with a focus on water in a lot of different forms.
So I'm really fascinated to sink my teeth into that one, just namely, not just being a Marine, because we were amphibious, right? you had to get comfortable with the water very quickly, but it was also the one resource that you can go without eating, but you got to have water. I still stay very hydrated to this day. I drink a lot of water. I drink a lot of alcohol, but I subsidize that with a lot of water as well. But also the power of water. Mm-hmm. And as soon as we're done, I'll show you. I was Pagosa did its hike the other day with some friends that were in town. Short hike, but there's a waterfall that I took the video in slow-mo, and it just, I know that's probably boring to a lot of people, but I think you'd have an appreciation for it.
It's gorgeous.
When you see it, but just realize the power behind it.
Right.
Is just, it's really fascinating of something we take for granted, how much power it really has. And if you think that you're in control of a lot of things, go dive into that waterfall and let me know how in control you are of things, because you're not going to be, because it has that much power to it. So it's fascinating, very, very fascinating. So I like to end cap all of these with, not that 20-year-old Todd would listen to present day Todd, but if you could turn back the hands of time and you knew that it would be worth it to go back for 5 minutes to have a conversation with 20-year-old Todd and say, if there's this one thing that you do or don't do, what is that thing you would tell 20-year-old Todd?
Go see the Grateful Dead. I missed out opportunities to do that, and then they started dying and they're gone, and I wish I had. And also go see the Allman Brothers more than you did. Seriously, I think life lessons. I know at the time I was aware of the angst I felt about, what am I doing? I got this education that cost $1 bazillion, and I don't know what I'm doing with my life, and I feel pressure to do these things. I would warn myself about what's coming in the 20s and say, this is going to be an interesting decade. It's going to be a struggle, but your education is going on beyond college, and it's going to change where you're doing your learning and how you're doing your learning and what you're learning about, and it's going to take a while to find your way, but just relax. Keep doing what you're doing, and it's going to work out. But that education is going to go for a while, and at least for me, coming out of my 20s was, I'm trying to think where in the life cycle of a butterfly it was. It was like out of the cocoon, but still kind of gooey and not there yet. And it took a lot of fumbling around. And I drop this on students a lot of times, especially when I have a lot of seniors in a class. It's like, God bless you, you're done and you've got through here, but be kind to yourself and realize you got a lot more learning to go, and it's okay if you don't fall into your lifelong career tomorrow morning after graduation.
Well, I tell you, I have looked forward to doing this episode, namely because I really do value the friendship and relationship we have since college, right? I could still have these conversations and knowing that, and I purposely surround myself with people that I can have conversations with, that I don't want to surround myself with yes people. I want to get their perspective. I want that I know that if I say something that you don't agree with, you go, well, I mean, here's this, but we can have, and that's what, and it goes back to what I've said several times through the show, is that I think that's what this country's missing, is the ability to sit down and have conversations. Yeah. And so I still value everything that I learned from you when I was in my undergraduate, to how, and as I articulated earlier in the show, how much what you helped me learn and become plays a role in present day a decade and a half later. So I do appreciate that, on your final day, that one day when you do retire from the mafiosa tenure track, you could say there was at least one person that I know of for fact that came through here and truly got value out of what you spent a lifetime learning to be able to go and demonstrate and teach in a classroom. Well,
thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And sometimes I compare teaching, at least at the college level, to gardening, in that I spend a semester or a couple semesters, if somebody takes a couple of my classes, sort of watering, feeding, fertilizing, weeding, and then the garden walks away and you don't see what happens. And it's been really gratifying to see how successful you've become and how much you've embraced learning. And it's like this, mighty oak tree or a huge tomato plant with lots of fruit on it. pick your metaphor. But it's really nice to get a chance to see how at least some people turn out and how great they're doing. So,
or like my wife says, I'm like a weed and really annoying.
Or that. but you're a robust weed.
That's it. I'm strong like bull, fast like deer.
There you go.
So people want to learn more about your books. Maybe they have questions. What's the best way to for them to learn more about your books on Amazon or anything else? This is your chance for a plug, or you don't need to do a plug. It doesn't, whatever you want to put out there.
Sure. I think all those books are available through Amazon. So they're out there. I've got a website at TCU. And I understand that when you send emails out, there's a chance to put some links in there. I can send you direct links to those purchasing opportunities and to my contact information at TCU. Should you be interested in talking to me about history, I invite you to email me.
And you'll be able to see this on the website under Todd Kerstetter, where you can click the Read More button by going to myexperiencedrealtor.com. That's experienced with an ED. You can click on Todd's episode, click the Read More. We'll have links and everything else in there for you to find these fabulous books. And always, if you're looking to buy and sell real estate anywhere on the planet, go on the homepage, click to find a trusted professional, and we'll get you someone that can take care of you. Dr. Kerstetter, thank you so much for coming in.
You're welcome.
What'd you think?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah?
You were right. The sales pitch proved true.